So I thought I might start with, maybe modern inertia. Modern inertia to me is something like autocorrect and texting. We just get carried away, we get into it, we go and we send things. So at Easter, I sent out a YouTube Easter video. And one of my clergy sent me this that afternoon. She said, I thought you'd get a kick out of this. I sent this text to my niece, and this is what it said. Wondering if you'll be going over to your mom's today. There is a urine message from the bishop. She tried to put YouTube, but she put urine instead. So her niece wrote back, yes, we will be there. Please send me this urine message. I am dying to see what a bishop says about pee on Easter. About a year ago, I was sent a message from my canon, my chair of budget and finance, said I needed to get my budget figures in because I was not there. And I wrote back, I'm waiting for Chris. That's what I thought, because Chris is our canon for finance. But what it said was, I'm waiting for Christ. And he wrote back, I am too, but I'm not sure I can wait that long. So it's important to know what we're talking about. So it's interesting that I was asked to speak about inertia because, quite frankly, my father used to say I could screw up the mechanical works of a bowling ball. So I have no scientific background whatsoever, so I had to go study it a little bit. I went and looked a little bit about inertia, and as Dan said, I was looking at it a little bit, but I wanted to learn really where did it all come from. So some of you will know this, and I'll probably butcher it a little bit, but Newton's first law of motion states that an object at rest stays at rest, and an object in motion stays in motion with the same speed and in the same direction unless acted upon by an unbalanced force. Objects tend to keep on doing what they're doing. In fact, it is the natural tendency of objects to resist changes in their state of motion. This tendency to resist changes in their state of motion is described as inertia. Inertia, in short, is the resistance an object has to a change in its state of motion. So Newton's conception of inertia stood in direct opposition to more popular conceptions about motion, conceptions that had stood for about 2,000 years prior to Newton. Because everybody before that thought that it was a natural tendency for objects to come to rest. Galileo, a premier scientist in the 17th century, developed the concept of inertia more. Now, Galileo also went on to propose theories of tides in 1616, the theory of comets in 1619, and for his brilliance, he was rewarded by the church as a heretic. He was put under house arrest for the rest of his life, and not until the year 2000 did Pope John Paul II formally apologize for this little mishap. Not totally unrelated to what we're talking about. I mean, I think it's ironic that the one that gave us inertia fell victim to inertia, the church. Sir Isaac Newton built on Galileo's thoughts about motion. Newton's first law of motion declares that a force is not needed to keep an object in motion. You can slide a book across the table and watch it slide, and it will slide and slide and slide. But it's not that it will come to a rest, it's that you need a force. Friction will actually stop it. And then there's mass. If you have more mass, you have more inertia. That's a quick science lesson just to say that those three things are important. The more massive the object, and this is important for our discussions, I think, in these days, the more that object resists changes in its state of motion. The more massive the object, the more that object resists changes in the state of motion. So the more we look at it, we can see that, like lots of things in our universe, our society, and our church, the concept itself is neutral. Inertia just is. It's not a negative or a positive as a concept, although we often see it that way. We, I think, would even say we're using it that way to some degree in this conference. but it's not negative. It just is. I would suggest maybe not. Forces and friction become very important too. Friction's equally interesting, equally needed, and we can't really talk about inertia without talking about friction and about mass. They're interrelated. So I don't want to get too far off from that, but I do want to talk about those two books that I mentioned to Dan when he called, because they may be actually a more accessible way for you to get this. I think they're very related to this. The first one is called Switch, How to Change Things When Change is Hard by Dan and Chip Heath. How many of you, anybody seen that? It's a great book. And The Power of Habit, Why We Do What We Do in Life and Business by Duhigg. I think these are all about what we're talking about tonight, using different terms. Switch takes into account three things: the rider, an elephant, and the path. And I'm going to talk about those in a minute. And The Power of Habit's more scientific, about brain function in that. So if we have inertia, friction, and mass, that's what we will talk about tonight. But I wanted to look at our title, How to Convert Inertia, Yours, Theirs, Ours, into Action. That's what we said we were going to talk about. And actually, when I first read that, I thought, this is a tall order for a brief talk. I mean, it might as well have said create life, you know. But I'm going to do my best. I'm going to take these in the reverse order because yours is the closest to home and maybe the most difficult. Theirs begs a question. Who is they? I think we don't get clear about that a lot. Who is they? And ours, well, that is us together, and maybe that is the best place to start tonight. So I think we first need to acknowledge, and we've heard a lot about that tonight, the world we inherit, the world you and I are in, the world of the church as we're trying to navigate it. Christianity, in many ways of late, has had the worst PR of just about any movement. It is confusing and unclear and contradictory. Butch Hancock, who sings with the Flatlanders, said, "Everything I learned about religion, God, and life came from my West Texas upbringing. It is there that I learned God loves you, and you are going straight to hell. And that sex is the ugliest, dirtiest, most vile, and despicable thing, so you should save it for someone you love." He also has on his album a song called "Judgment Day Was Yesterday, How'd You Do?" So we walk into that world because a lot of people see it that way, where the church has not always been helpful. Tom Ehrlich says the church keeps answering questions no one is asking. And that's inertia. It's moving in a direction we keep answering questions no one is asking, because that's what we do. And we just keep doing it. So let's talk about ours first. Ours. I want to start with a quote. "The great burden and annoyance that I have is that the church plans a little work as if it were to be done in our own strength and as cheap as possible. We go home and set timidly about it as if we had overestimated our ability. Then we falter and hesitate. We begin to murmur, then to grumble, and finally become indifferent. The church that prides itself on its historic continuity with the apostles, who took the world in their embrace and dared to live and die to save it, sighs and declines. We drop our parish net at the corner of a fine avenue and tie it to a splendid building, and a good many of us come over on Sunday mornings and a few on Sunday evenings to see if any fish have been wise or foolish enough to come into our handsome net. And yet, but a block away, there is a great multitude of men to whom the heavens are brass, the earth a martyrdom, the church but a name, busy with nothing but hanging the millstone about the neck of human weakness that it may sink out of sight and die. I say that we fear to launch out into the deep of humanity and instead go all our lives long coasting along the shore of opportunity, privilege, and power. Someday soon the church will have to give an account, and I fear for it." Spoken in 1909 at the convention of the Diocese of Montana by Bishop Lee Brewer. The more massive the object, the more that object resists changes in the state of motion. It reminds me very much of family systems theory, especially Bowen's theory, who really relied on Rabbi Edwin Friedman, who many of you have studied, who said that our present situation, and I do say ours, yours and mine in this church with a capital C, is a problem of focus. We get trapped in a situation where our focus shifts towards pathology rather than strength. Safety becomes more important than adventure. Adaptation is toward the dependent, and empathy becomes more important than responsibility. The more massive the object, the more that object resists changes in its state of motion. If you read The Failure of Nerve by Friedman, published after his death, he worked with a major denomination that goes unnamed, but he asked them this question: if you had $50 million just fall into your lap, what would you do with it? And they answered, we would find the 500 or 50 worst parishes, and we'd give it to them. And he said, exactly, that's your problem. You ought to take the 500 or 50 of your top performers and give it to them. But we're into empathy, not responsibility. The more massive the object, the more that object resists changes in its state of motion. So I think this resistance of ours comes in a lot of different packages. Our collective resistance. I say we in the Episcopal Church are going to chat ourselves to death. Another way to put it is we are just waiting. We do a lot of that. Remember the Dr. Seuss book, Oh, the Places You'll Go? Yeah, it was read at every graduation for about 5 years after it came out. But one of the great places in that book are called the waiting place, where people just wait. Waiting for a train to go or a bus to come or a plane to go or the mail to come or the rain to go or the phone to ring or the snow to snow or waiting around for a yes or a no or waiting for their hair to grow. Everyone's just waiting. Waiting for the fish to bite or waiting for wind to fly a kite or waiting around for Friday night or waiting perhaps for their Uncle Jake or a pot to boil or a better break or a string of pearls or a pair of pants or a wig with curls or another chance. Everyone's just waiting. I added some. Waiting on the old rector to go. Waiting on the new rector to come. Waiting for all these other folks to get off their bum. Waiting on the bishop to visit, waiting on him or her to leave. If I hear I'm spiritual, not religious again, I think I'm going to heave. Waiting on a resolution to pass, waiting until I don't have gas, waiting for my thing to win, waiting for your thing to lose, waiting for my hack to top out, waiting for the church to once again have clout. Just waiting. This is my greatest fear. We have a paralysis that's allowing inertia just to carry us to whatever end we think it might carry us. The religious industrial complex we built in the 50s and which served us well will not get us to the next thing. But we're still driving it as if it would. Yes, we continue to make what some see as progress. Things do change, but I'm not so sure we're not continuing to fight the last war. You see, with inertia, we don't really get a choice of deciding to act or not. If we're going to buy this model, no decision is a decision. We're going to keep moving towards something, moving in a direction. No decision is a decision. No action is action. In this model we're using, we actually need some friction and then a force for action to ensue, for a new direction to begin. But we don't like that much because empathy is more important than responsibility. And because we have this culture in the church that we have to be nice. Be nice. That's one of our highest values, and nothing's wrong with it except the fact that everything, every big conversation we need to have, every rub we need to address, every risk we could put forward is smothered in the sabotage of nice. Actually, I want to take issue with that because we can be nice and clear. Clarity is our friend. So if we're going to use this metaphor, you and I have to look around and name it when we see it. I do that my way, you'll do it yours, and that will be applied friction. But maybe in this group, and I hope we can evangelize more and more across our people, we can vow to listen to one another and not be so quick to judge to our crazy, outlandish, wonderful ideas. So here's one that I'll talk about for hours. And it will not surprise you if you know me. This is one place I see our collective denial, our collective inertia, where we just keep barreling down the road and we just will not apply friction or change. We just let inertia take us. And it's money. It's often the smallest things. It's interesting in Derek's stuff up here, we get blamed for being about power and money, which I find so interesting because we are terrible at dealing with it within ourselves. So, the monetary offering in the liturgy. I came into the House of Bishops almost 6 years ago and immediately realized we almost never took an offering up at the Eucharist we did. And so I began asking and trying to figure out the channels we go through for that. And this last meeting, we started doing it. Nobody's reported to me how much we made. I don't know if we'll ever hear of that, but it was a lot. And what I always hear is that is not connected to some of our bigger issues, the ones we don't want to talk about, especially mixed company in the church because we want to be nice. That almost 50% of dioceses don't give their full asking. You want to know the third rail? That's the third rail. But that's empathy versus responsibility. Not even having the conversation. They are connected. So, some of you that were at General Convention will remember I staged a little protest there because at General Convention we also didn't take offerings at the Eucharist. We gathered every day, literally thousands of us, and only took one offering on Sunday. And I asked, why? And I was told it takes too much time. Then I was told it's not in the customary. So I decided to just tweet, Facebook, every chance I got a microphone, I said, we're just going to throw money at the baptismal font. Just come in and throw it on the ground. My premise is, if we make a mess, somebody has to clean it up. And people responded. There were big mounds of money around the font every day. I mean, a general convention where the rhetoric and the narrative was dripping with fear about money. You see this in search processes all the time. I do. Every profile I've ever read is dripping with fear of money, of sustainability, and yet in the bishops' searches I've been in, I've never been asked once whether I tithed, what my spirituality around money was. Sometimes I would bring it up. Why is that? Because we're into empathy more than responsibility. By the way, I was actually in a bishop search here in the land of enchantment. It was memorable because I think they were typing the rejection letter while I was on the phone with them. I think it actually arrived before the interview was over. The 11 of you from New Mexico, you dodged a bullet. See, there you go. So, this comes out in interesting euphemisms, too. Like I was talking to a priest the other day in my diocese who had not yet asked for money for Haiti. And really, I do. I ask for money all the time. And they said, Bishop, what we figured out is that we've reached our funding capacity. I said, well, how do you figure that? I mean, tell me how you figure funding capacity. Well, it's just a feel. Just a feel. We just asked too much. This is one of my new things I'm going to write about, calculating generosity. It's another way to have empathy and not responsibility. Just calculate it. So, setting your hair on fire, why don't we talk about as a church whether we need to reorder our sacraments? It's interesting, our sacraments, the order of our sacraments, developed in a time when it was dangerous to be a Christian. We don't live in that time anymore. Why don't we at least have that conversation? Inertia. So, buildings. The reason we're here, I'm glad there's a workshop called Nomadic. We're a nomadic people. We didn't just put stakes in the ground, we put concrete slabs with rebar and solid walls. And then when all the people moved away, we didn't know what to do. Couldn't pack up the tent. But I really can make a good argument for having buildings. We need an address. For me, the metaphor is a base camp. Churches ought to be base camps. We come there to heal, to get fed, to learn, to prepare. But in a base camp, you never stay. You go on. Reggie McNeil, he uses an airport, which I like a lot too. He says, there are lots of airports I like more than others. There are none of them I want to stay in. I feel the same way. They serve a purpose. You go there to get what you need, to get on your next flight, and to get out. That's what our churches can be too, and we need an address for that. So theirs, that's in that theme, in the title for tonight. Who is they? Every time I see theirs and we ask this question, who is they? Is it the people, when I read that first I was thinking, is it the people we look at in the pew when we're up at the front of the church, or is it the people who never darken the door? Who's they? It'd be good for us to figure that out. James Wellman, who's a professor at the University of Washington, he has this comparative religion class, and he sends out his 20-something students across Seattle. He sends them to two churches specifically. Mars Hill, which is a non-denominational mega church, 5,000 people a Sunday, mostly in their 20s and 30s. And he sends them to St. Mark's Cathedral, our Episcopal Cathedral. And this is what he told our clergy when he came to see us. He said, I sent them out and I said, well, what did you think of Mars Hill? And they said, man, it was just energy. It was great. Didn't believe a word the guy said. Don't believe any of that stuff. What about St. Mark's? Man, I tell you, it was a great, great thing too. They really believe in what they're doing. We just don't know what it is. Now, see, that's one where we don't know whether to laugh or cry. Because then he asked them, if you had to go to church next Sunday, if I put a gun to your head and said you had to go, where would you go? Mars Hill. Why? You just told me you didn't believe a word he said. It's true, but we believe he believes it. He's authentic. I don't believe what he says, but I believe he believes it. It's interesting. Then we can laugh that off. We can say, well, I guess it's all about entertainment. These are some of the things I'll get back to that. Or we can take it seriously and figure out, what is it? There's something wrong when we say, oh, those people really believe in what they believe in, but I just don't know what it is. That's inertia. Something for us to think about. Peter Stanke had never gone to Compline. He went to Compline at St. Mark's Cathedral. It's been going on for 50 plus years. It is what it is. It lasts 30 minutes. 600 to 700 people show up every Sunday night, mostly in their 20s and 30s. They lay all over the altar. When the creed comes, they all stand. You ask them, why do you do that? I don't know. It's what they do here. It's still pretty moving. We went in and sat next to a 20-something, tattooed, pierced, and he asked her when it was over, why do you come here? And she said, well, I just want you to know I don't believe all that religious shit. He said, I know, why do you come here? He said, well, I just need something more. And this is something more. Who's they? So in our diocese, one thing I'm trying to do is to figure that out. Last year, we had Russ Crabtree come in and do what's really the insider look. He surveyed everyone that would put up with it. He said it was the best return rate he's gotten. We had a great turnout from that. He said, you're in one of the best states I've seen. You're ready for change. And he left us with this note. All the things that got you here in these last 5 or 6 years will not do what you need to do next. You're going to have to completely retool. So this year, we've put together a steering, visioning committee of mostly 20 and 30-year-olds. And the idea is that his was an inside look. What do the insiders think? Who do they think we are as us? And their job is a much harder one, actually. They're trying to figure out, what do they say we are? It's been very difficult. It's been interesting. And you talk about inertia and friction. One of the first things they said is, we will not meet on church property. We're going to meet in public places. And the inertia about that, it only took 2 or 3 meetings before somebody said, why don't we just meet in one of our churches? It was interesting. But we've gone to many different places, public libraries, community colleges. We're about to go to a bar. We're going to go to the Rainier Club. There was some protest about that. I said, that's the world. What do they say? And it's been interesting when we go to public places. We get a lot of people asking us questions. They want to know who we are. But it's shown me, for sure, how unengaged we are with the they. Which brings us to yours, which is the most difficult, because only you can answer it, I think. Now, this is where I want to quickly switch back to that book I was telling you about, Switch. And I want to talk about this one little part, which talks about clocky, an alarm clock. Does anybody own a clocky? Well, in a minute, I bought one for my 17-year-old son for his birthday. He did not appreciate it. And you're about to find out why. Clocky, an alarm clock invented by an MIT student. It's no ordinary alarm clock. It has wheels. You set it at night, and in the morning, when the alarm goes off, it rolls off your nightstand and scurries around the room, forcing you to chase it down. Picture the scene. You're crawling around the bedroom in your underwear, stalking and cursing a runaway clock. Clocky ensures that you won't snooze button your way to disaster. And apparently that's a common fear, since about 35,000 units were purchased at $50 each in the first 2 years it was on the market. So the success of this invention reveals a lot about human psychology. What it shows fundamentally is that we're all schizophrenic. We have two parts of our mind. Our brains aren't of one mind. And that's where they get the rider and the elephant and the path. The rider analyzes. The elephant just goes. And all of us have that. Every organization has that. And you've got to get both of them going together. And that's our difficulty. That's the inertia that we're living with now. So, yours. There's a couple things I did when I became bishop, or even before. One is, ever since I've even been a rector or vicar of a church, I've had 10 rules for respect that have been part of my letters of agreement, which talk about how we're going to communicate with one another and the attempt to not triangulate, which is one of the hugest problems we have with inertia in our church with dealing with one another. The other one was to do a mutual ministry review every year, and all of the last 5 we've done that, and then report it out to convention so that we're checking our relationships at regular intervals. And then the other is, when I went through the walkabout, I was very concerned because, they looked at me and thought, this guy could be bishop for 32 years. That frightened me too. I mean, a bishop of the Episcopal Church is a life sentence, So I told them, in 12 years, I will leave, or I'll be talking to you about where I'm going to go, and we will discern together. Because inertia doesn't tend to set in. I actually did a little bit of studying on episcopacies, and it seems like that was a major point. 12 to 15 years was where it got difficult or stale. Not always, but for me, I know my rhythms, and so I've got to get out. So yours, that part of this equation may be the most difficult because you're going to have to answer it. You're going to have to name it. You're going to have to get spiritual directors and trusted colleagues and people from outside this whole realm you and I live in to tell you the truth, and then you're going to have to really take some risks, or we'll be locked into empathy rather than responsibility. What Friedman went on to say is that if we're going to break out of that, you have to have leaders that do 5 things. Leaders who can separate themselves enough from the emotional processes around them so that they can see things differently. Leaders who are hell-bent to pursue their vision. Leaders who can persist in the face of the sabotage of others, enemies, and colleagues. Leaders who are challenged where others are made anxious. And leaders who value adventure more than safety. That's how, or one way, we'll get out of it. Not an easy thing, though. And we have to check ourselves on that all the time. So I'm going to end tonight with a story that I've been living over these past 5 years as a bishop. One thing I really realize is I got to get outside of the office and outside of the church. And every Monday, for about 4 years, my wife and I have gone to a bar. We go at noon, and I missed it today. But if I'm home, that's where we are. And the very first time we went to this particular place, the bartender came out from the bar because we weren't sitting at the bar, we were sitting at a table, and he asked us, "Do you want another drink?" And I said, "I don't know, we're thinking about it." And he said, "Well, there are no priests around here." And he left. Now, this is what clicked in for me. If you're a clergy, you know this thought. I thought, do I want to tell? You know, it's that dilemma about, do I get on a plane with a collar or not? But I decided I would. I took out my card and I laid it on the table. And he came back and he picked up the card and he said, "Holy shit." I said, "Yeah, I get that all the time." And we just kept going back and going back. And about 8 months in, he would ask every Monday, "Where were you yesterday? Tell me about it." About 8 months in, he said, "Where are you going to be Christmas Eve?" I said, "I'll be at the cathedral." He said, "Can I come?" "Yeah, you can come." And he asked me this question, where will I sit? And I want to tell you, I just heard that question as a dumb question. That's my confession to you. I thought, that's an idiotic question. Where do you sit? "Well, you'll sit with my family. You know, we'll make sure you have a seat." I said, "Okay, I think I'm going to come." So Christmas Eve, I'm sitting there in this rocking chair that I sit in, waiting for the service to start. I get up and look, and he's not there. So I text him. I say, "Hey, where are you?" And he texts back, "I'm standing out in front of the cathedral." And he asked it again, "Where do I sit?" Then it hit me. That is a loaded question. That's the question. That's inertia. That question is laden with, is there room in there for me? You'd take somebody like me? What do you do in there? What will I do in there? Lots of questions. So I texted him back in great detail. "Walk in those big doors. There'll be people with paper. They'll give you some." "Take it. Tell them I'm with the bishop's family." And when he tells the story now, he says, "I did exactly what he said, and it was like the Red Sea parted." He said everything And they took me to the front row and they set me down with his wife. And then I came processing out on Christmas Eve, you know, mitre and cope, and everybody was being so Episcopalian and lovely and serene. And I looked up and he's just dying laughing in the front row. I mean, I walked by him, he said, "Liberace would have loved that thing." So then he came to Easter Vigil. Next Christmas Eve, he brought 2 people with him from the bar. And he makes a joke about being C and E. But the other day I heard him talking and he said, "I think I'm an Episcopalian now." Now he's not. He's never been confirmed. Canonically, he's not. But he is. And in the course of that, he invited my wife and I to what had become church for him. They do a thing called sandwich night. And he had trepidation about asking me to come to that. It's an interesting mix of people. It's a cocktail party. It lasts exactly from 6 to 9. And to get in, you have to bring 25 sandwiches made for the homeless shelter for men over 55. That's your admission ticket. And I was able to hang out there for about 4 times before I was revealed. But it was just long enough to tear the inertia down. Now that is where we're supposed to be. That is church. I'm so glad we had this time together. Thank you.